So what is epidemiology? So you remember the word epi and demos. So it is from Greek, which is upon the people. So when epidemiology began, the origins of epidemiology, it was the study of patterns of disease in populations. Okay, so it began with the study of epidemics and it began as a study of patterns of disease in populations. Today, we have expanded the scope of epidemiology so that we study not just pattern of disease, but we also study pattern of health. And this is the definition that you are supposed to remember of epidemiology. Okay, so now that you're in fourth semester, it's important that you remember epidemiology is the core of community medicine. It's important that we apply all what you learn, whether it's demography, biostatistics, all of those tools are used for us to understand about health and disease. So according to John Last, the study epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of health related states and events. Okay, so when we say health related states and events, it also includes disease and the application of this study to the control of health related problems. So it's not just a study, okay, logi, but we also use it. It's an application. So I will repeat it. Epidemiology is defined as the study of the distribution and determinants of health related states and events and the application of this study to the control of health problems. So as you can see, it talks about distribution and determinants. So these are the two branches of epidemiology where we have, when you look only at distribution, we call it a descriptive epidemiology. And when we try to look at determinants, we're looking at causes and risk factors, that is analytical epidemiology. So the uses of epidemiology is, one very important one is you can describe the spectrum of disease. Okay, so beginning with a usual mild childhood illness, which is measles, can also result in subacute sclerosing pan encephalitis, and this is a late sequelae of the disease. So the using the epidemiological study design, okay, looking at cases and looking at controls, because cases, children with measles had more likely chance of developing SSP compared to those who did not have, and therefore the conclusion that measles was the one that was causing 6 to 8 months later a sequelae of SSP. Okay, so you can understand the full gamut, the spectrum of disease, because we are using epidemiological study designs. Okay, so an important use of epidemiology is to describe the spectrum of disease. Then another use is to describe the natural history of disease. Okay, how disease will evolve in the absence of intervention. That is the natural history of disease. For example, if a person is infected with HIV, what is the progression towards acquired immunodeficiency syndrome? Okay, so what is the progression? So natural history. When we talk about natural history, that means there is no intervention. When we intervene with either disease or in the disease process with either health promotion methods, or you use a vaccine, or if you intervene with nutritional interventions, if there's any intervention, it's no longer a natural history. Okay, so natural history is in the event of without intervention in the disease process, how it will evolve. Okay, so that is natural history of disease. Then we can also identify factors which increase the risk of acquiring disease. Okay, risk factors. Okay, so like smoking. Okay, today smoking has been upgraded. While it is a risk factor for other conditions, it has been upgraded to a cause for cancer, especially lung cancer. We can also predict disease trends using mathematical models. For example, if you look at data and we say that an estimated 5 million people are affected with HIV/AIDS, this is not because we have tested everybody and we have found they are positive for HIV. It's because we have done scanning. We look at women, number of pregnant women who have the infection. We look at sentinel data. We look at hospitals which are reporting cases of HIV/AIDS. And then there is a modeling which is done to predict how many people would be estimated to have the disease. So we can predict disease trends using mathematical models, using epidemiological methods. We can also elucidate. Elucidate means understand. We can elucidate mechanisms of disease transmission, which what is occurring right now. In the COVID pandemic, we are still trying to understand the mechanisms of transmission. Okay, for example, we know that this is an airborne disease, but is there a transmission? What happens when the person who is infected with COVID, okay, when they pass the stools, when they use thing, is there aerosolization occurring from that as well? Okay, so we are trying to understand the mechanisms of disease transmission in this current pandemic, okay, because this agent is new. And this was very important for us to achieve the eradication of smallpox, okay, because we understood how the disease was being transmitted, and we understood that for smallpox there was no carrier status, that if somebody had smallpox infection, it resulted in the disease. There was no subclinical infection. So there were many features of the smallpox, disease that made it suitable for eradication, and also the availability of a potent vaccine. We can also use it to test the efficacy of intervention strategies. So vaccination is a form of intervention. Field trials are carried out among healthy people. Okay, vaccine trials, field trials, all of these efficacy of intervention strategies, these are again uses of epidemiology. We can also use it to evaluate the intervention. So not just test efficacy to know whether it's going to have an effect, but once you have a program in place, you will also know that whether it's going to be effective. And a good example for this is the typhoid vaccine. So the typhoid vaccine, the initial one which came out, was very effective in the animal studies, okay, in the trial phase. But when it came into human trial phase, it was not as effective, okay. So then it was stopped, okay. So the initial vaccines which were produced were not as effective as the current vaccines which we have. So we can test the efficacy as well as we can evaluate any intervention program which are in place. We can identify the health needs of the community, and this is called as community diagnosis. So you carry out a survey in the community and you identify both what are the felt needs as well as what are the unmet needs of the community. Okay, so you can look at what is the birth rate, what is the crude rate, what are the illnesses in this community, what is the mortality rate, okay, and what is the need of this community, okay, whether it is related to health, it's related to disease, whether it's related to health-related behaviors, health-seeking patterns, improvement in their knowledge, okay, whether they just need better knowledge how to take care of themselves. We can identify the needs of the community, okay, and this is what you were supposed to have had undergone in the community. We would have taken for you for community diagnosis in the third semester, but because of the pandemic and we've all been at home, so we will be looking at how we can give you exposure to community diagnosis in the fourth semester. Okay, so we are working on that, and we will in the subsequent classes let you know how we plan to carry out community diagnosis for you as a class. We can also use epidemiology to evaluate public health programs. Okay, so we have a vitamin A prophylaxis program in which under 5 children are given twice a year vitamin A. Okay, this is to reduce the occurrence of acute respiratory infections, as well as also to take care of vitamin A deficiency. Okay, the ocular manifestations, xerophthalmia and all of that. Okay, so this program is in place, and to see how it is doing, whether we need any changes, we need any uses, whether it's effective or not, we can also use it. So we can be used to understand what is the cause of disease. We can use it to understand what is the spectrum of disease. We can use it to understand the natural history of disease. We can use it to evaluate interventions. We can use epidemiology to evaluate programs that we have in place. So epidemiology is very important in public health. And epidemiology is also important to the clinician, because what we get from large studies can be useful for the clinician, for the individual. Okay. Now, this is a basic classification of how epidemiological designs work. Epidemiological designs are for the studies that we carry out. So the basic classification of epidemiological study designs is observational studies and experimental or interventional studies. Now, what does this term mean? Observational study and experiment. Okay. In an observational study, the researcher, the investigator, the study person does not intervene in the disease process. Okay. We only observe. We do not manipulate. We are not associated with the exposure. And therefore, these are called as observational studies. The minute we carry out some intervention, some action, some experiment in the study group, then it is called as an interventional study. Okay, so the basic classification is observational study and experimental or interventional studies. Observational studies can be further classified as descriptive studies and analytical studies. All experimental studies are analytical in nature. Okay, so in analytical studies, you can have observational analytical studies and you can have experimental study designs. Descriptive studies can further be cross-sectional in nature. They can be ecological studies. They can be longitudinal studies. Analytical studies can be case control studies, cohort studies, as well as cross-sectional studies. Experimental studies can be clinical trials. Clinical trials are carried out among patients, persons who are affected with the disease. Field trials are carried out among healthy population, and then you can have community intervention trials where the intervention is at the level at a group of people in the community. So it can be at the level of the village or towns or cities. Okay, so you can have community intervention trials. So this is in broad a nice chart that will show you. So you can be asked, because you're learning both basic epidemiology and now you will be looking at advanced epidemiology. When we ask you about types of epidemiological designs, it's good for you to remember this chart. So going ahead with epidemiological studies, observational studies can be ecological nature. An ecological study is also called as a correlational study. And the unit of the population in an ecological study is the whole population, okay, not individuals. The unit of study in an ecological study is populations. Okay, in a cross-sectional study is also known as a prevalence study. It is also known as a survey. It is done at one point in time, and the unit of study is individual people. So you go to each individual and you collect data. Okay, it's not at the population level, but at individual level data is being collected. A case control study is also called as a case reference study. And again, the unit of study are individuals. Similarly, for cohort study, a cohort study is a longitudinal study. So a cohort study is also known as a follow-up study, again looking at individuals. Now, when we look at experimental studies, we have community trials, which are also known as community intervention studies. And these are carried out at the level of communities. Then you have field trials, which are carried out among healthy individuals. Then you have randomized controlled trials, which are or RCTs, which are carried out among individuals. And then you have clinical trials. These are therapeutic studies, which are carried out among patients. Okay, so it's important that we understand very clearly. So if I say ecological study, I'm referring to a population. If I say cross-sectional study, this is a prevalence study, which is carried out among individuals. A case control study is also a case reference study, again looking at individuals, and so on and so forth. Okay, and what you need to remember, when we use the word clinical trials, we're looking at patients. Okay, so when you use a terminology, you have to understand what is the unit of study and what is important. And the most important is what is an observational study and what is experimental. So in the study which is about observational studies, the investigator is not carrying out any intervention. We are not interfering with exposure. Okay, we are not the ones who are exposing. Exposure has already occurred and we are only observing. Okay, we are only carrying out observation. Therefore, they are called as observational. The minute we intervene, we manipulate, we offer an intervention, we offer health education, we offer a vaccine, okay, or we ask them to carry out certain physical activity, certain type of physical activity, or we offer a certain type of diet, or we offer a certain medicine, it becomes experimental. Okay, so these are all interventions. So in clinical research, there is a progression of study design. Most often what you get is, if there is something unusual, you will have a physician, attending physician, who will write a case report. because this is an unusual presentation. For example, if a lady presents with a large ovarian tumor weighing a large about 1 kg, now that is quite unusual. Okay, so then they will write up, okay, they'll write up a case report. They will describe about the patient, okay, what were the presentation sign, what investigations they carried out, what was unusual, and they will report it. Okay, so what will happen is you get isolated case reports. Once you have a case report and you get a frequent occurrence, then you can write up a case series. Okay, case series is many case reports which come together. They are called as case series. Once you have sufficient number of case series and you feel that you need an investigation into this, then you can carry out an observational study. So you start out with case reports. As clinicians, you start out with case reports, then you report a case series. Then you say it justifies, it seems to be occurring more commonly, let's carry out a survey. And then you start with observational studies. So always starting point for analytical studies, after you have had some description, will be observational studies. You do not go straight away to experimental studies, because experimental studies have a lot of implications, a lot of ethical concerns. You will need clearance. For every study research, you will need clearance. So you always begin with observational studies and then you will go up the ladder. Okay, so what we've written, you start with a cross-sectional study. If you get some evidence from there, then you will go ahead for a case control study. If you get sufficient evidence from there, you don't know if you may get, you may not get, ambivalent, you want to know more, then you can carry out a cohort study. Once you have cohort study, you get some information, then you can go ahead and see if there is any intervention that we can offer, and then you go for a RCT, a randomized control trial or a clinical trial. And now the highest level of evidence in research, whether it is clinical research or it is public health research, is a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is where we take a group of studies, whether it's RCTs or cohort studies. We take good studies and we club them together and we draw evidence from many studies which have been conducted together. That is called as a meta-analysis. So what you have to know is that the highest level of evidence, till recently it used to be an RCT. An RCT still remains the gold standard for any therapy. We cannot introduce therapy without RCTs. Okay, despite whatever results they may give you in the lab, we have to have randomized control trials. Now, one level above an RCT is a meta-analysis of RCTs. Okay, so the highest level of evidence for research is offered by a meta-analysis. Now, an example for you here to understand is, what is the role of oxygen in retrolental fibroplasia or RLF among premature infants? Now, retrolental fibroplasia is a form of blindness which was seen in premature infants. Okay, so people thought that this blindness was occurring because of the prematurity. Okay, because the children were born early and therefore they were developing this blindness. But someone came up with the idea, is it because that they are premature, or is it because of the oxygen that we are giving premature children, because they require higher doses of oxygen because their lungs are not very mature? Okay, so that was the hypothesis. What is the role of oxygen? Is it the oxygen? So initially doctors were very offended because oxygen was saving the lives of the baby. But someone raised the question saying, is this oxygen one of the side effects also is that it's causing blindness? Okay, so let's see how this hypothesis progressed. Okay, so the first case of retrolental fibroplasia was reported by Dr. Clifford in Boston. Okay, in the 1940s. Then in 1941, there was a series. There were a number of children who developed this blindness, and therefore a case series was reported. Following that, a case control study was carried out among 53 children who had retrolental fibroplasia, and they took children who were normal, who did not have this fibroplasia. They took 298 children. Okay, so, and they were looking at whether oxygen was responsible for this blindness or not. So an association was observed, but still it was postulated. Doctors were not willing, okay, not willing to agree. It was postulated that it was the poor health of the infants which required them to have longer hours of oxygen, and therefore it was the poor health and not the oxygen use which caused RLF. Okay, so there was still debate. Yes, no, no, don't know. Then they went on to do cohort studies. Still the results were contradictory. Okay, because there are a lot of confounding factors. Is it the prematurity which is causing it? Child is weak, child is ice, therefore child is more likely to have, or is it oxygen? Okay, still questioning. So then they carried out a randomized control trial. In what they did was they had a group in which premature children were taken and one group were given oxygen, the other group was not given, and then they watched and they saw. Okay, and when they did a randomized control trial, offering one group of children oxygen and the other children were not oxygen, that confirmed the role of oxygen as one of the causes of retrolental fibroplasia. Okay, so this is just for you to understand that whenever a hypothesis comes up, in order to prove that hypothesis, we need advanced epidemiological methods. We need to use just descriptive studies are not enough. We need to follow either observational studies or observational analytical studies, or we need to use experimental studies in order for us to come up either to disprove the hypothesis or to prove it. So the questions that we ask are very important. So what you're learning in epidemiology is, as clinicians, as maybe people who will be interested looking at after patients, it's important that we understand how to address health-based research. So we need to ask questions. Okay, it's very important. Whenever you carry out research, we ask a question. So in epidemiology, what are the questions that we ask? In descriptive epidemiology, we ask, how important is the problem? So what is the magnitude of the problem? Okay. Among whom does it occur? Okay. Where does it occur and when does it occur? Okay. Right now in COVID, we are still having a lot of descriptive because this is something new. Okay. So we have understood COVID occurs more often. It occurs among people, but it is more severe for those who are elderly. It is more severe for those who have comorbidities. Okay. So therefore, these are the people that we need to protect. Then healthcare workers are the ones who are exposed to more severe cases. So we need to take care of our healthcare workers, physicians, nurses, the staff, okay, the non-medical staff, as well as the people who are handling, the people who handle the body. We need to protect all of them as well. The people who are sitting in the lab, who are looking at the specimens. Okay, all those who are exposed. Okay, so we are looking, what is the magnitude of the problem? It is a pandemic. Okay, so all of these are descriptive questions. How important is the problem? Among whom does it occur? Where does it occur? And when does it occur? So in descriptive epidemiology, we are looking at time, place, and person. So whenever we say descriptive epidemiology, we're talking about time, place, and person. Okay, so we are looking at the distribution of the disease. So the first half of the definition, the study of distribution. So when we look at distribution, that is descriptive epidemiology. Now the second type, and also very important, is analytical epidemiology. It is not analytical because we are doing data analysis. We do data analysis in both studies, in descriptive as well as in, but it is called as analytical because we are testing a hypothesis. We have a hypothesis, a research hypothesis. What is the cause of the problem? We want to identify the cause. We want to look at the etiology, and therefore we need to carry out sophisticated epidemiological studies in order to identify the causes of disease or the health problem. Okay, and therefore it is called as analytical epidemiology because we are testing hypothesis. In descriptive studies, we generate hypothesis and we test the hypothesis in analytical studies. Okay. So the basic question in analytical epidemiology is exposure linked to disease? So when I say exposure, that means an exposure can be smoking, an exposure can be tobacco chewing, an exposure can be taking OC, oral contraceptive pills, an exposure can be sedentary lifestyle. Okay, so is exposure linked to disease? That is the question that we're asking. If a person smokes, what is the likelihood that they will develop lung cancer? If a person smokes, what is the likelihood that they will develop oral cancer? Okay, so if a person is exposed, okay, to UV light, what is the risk of disease? So we are asking the question in analytical, are exposure and the disease linked? Okay, so now because we're expanding, it can be just not just disease, it can be a health problem, it can be a health condition as well. Because exposure can also be a good exposure. For example, if I have an active life, okay, if I carry out, if I go to the gym and I work out for 2 hours a day or 1 hour a day, okay, am I in better health because I have gone to the gym, because I'm working out? So exposure can be both exposures which are linked to disease and also can be linked to health. Okay, so we're both studying both exposure, whether it's linked to health and disease. So at this point of time, I just want to raise to you, okay, when we are looking at whether two factors are associated and linked, when we're trying to draw conclusions, so we have to be aware. Okay, so this is a Texas sharpshooter. Okay, can you see him? Okay, see what he has done. He has a board in front of him and he has a gun, and he has fired his gun, and now he is drawing the target along the shot. Now, many times when we carry out studies, it's very important that the identification of a cluster and the source population is too often like a Texas sharpshooter who first fires the bullet and then draws a target around it. Okay, so we carry out on a study and we say, oh, study is very good. Okay, it's done very well. We have met all our thing, but we are firing our own bullet and we are drawing our own target. It's very important that we should identify the population very correctly. Okay, and we should identify and we should try to get as close to the answer as we want, not fire the bullet and then say what we have found is correct. Okay, so whenever we carry out research, we carry out a study, we have to be careful that we are not drawing our own target, but we are trying to get as close to the actual target. So in the community, what is happening, and in the hospital, so the hospital is a different setting and the community is a different setting. Okay, so if you look at hospital, you talk to doctors who are working in hospital. COVID is a very severe, serious illness, can be severe, serious. But if you look in the community, 95% in Nepal are staying in the community, in their home, and they're recovering. So if I go to the community and I see a different picture. But if I come to the hospital, I see a different picture. And that is what you need to keep in mind. So when we do our studies in a hospital, we'll always get a more severe picture. When we carry out the study in the community, we get a different picture. And therefore, in epidemiology, community-based studies have far more value than hospital-based studies. Okay, hospital-based studies have their place, but community-based studies are always given much more value. Okay, because they give the real picture. Okay, hospital study-based studies will always be more severe. Now let us look at descriptive studies. So a descriptive study is one which is done on only one group. And I'm doing here because this was done I taken it, and I hope that now by 4th semester you would have bought your textbooks and that you will start reading for yourself. Okay, a descriptive study is one in which only one group. It is called descriptive because we have a comparison group. We have only one group. You have a group of people having the outcome. It could be a disease or any other health related phenomenon. Okay, so you take a group of pregnant women, that's a descriptive study. You take a group of women with anemia, that's a descriptive study. You take children with who are malnourished, that is a descriptive study. You take persons with diabetes mellitus, that's a descriptive study. So when you have one group of people with a particular condition, okay, and you're studying them, that is a descriptive study. Okay, there is no comparison group. So what do we do in that? We describe the outcome, health related phenomenon. We look at it in terms of frequency. Okay, so we take a group of pregnant women and we see, okay, among these pregnant women, how many have anemia? Okay, how many are not gaining weight adequately? Okay, so you've taken a group of women and then you're looking at whatever is the condition you're describing. So frequency, distribution, you're looking at it in terms of time, place, and person. Okay, so you're looking at which trimester. Okay, so time, place, as well as person. So descriptive studies, we can use them for drugs, distribution of outcomes in terms of person, time, and place. They can be used. What is the use of descriptive studies? An important thing is we can allocate resources and we can also educate people. And more importantly, we can generate hypotheses. Okay, so we can say, okay, women who are vegetarian, who consume more vegetarian diet, they're more likely to have anemia as compared to women who eat non-vegetarian food. Okay, so hypothesis generation is the process of developing a list of possible candidates for the causes of the disease. Okay, so you're looking at among pregnant women, you take a group of women, pregnant women, so you have one group and you have some women who have anemia and those who don't have anemia. Then you try to see, okay, why these women are having anemia. Okay, because among pregnant women, the rate of anemia is around 50%. That means you will get half have anemia and half don't have anemia. So if you want to understand why these women have anemia and why those women don't have anemia, okay, then you can make a possible list. Okay, so they are eating vegetarian food, these are eating non-vegetarian food. Maybe these women, they've had multiple pregnancies. This might be a primigravida. So there may be differences between them. So you try to identify the differences, why certain people are having anemia, why they don't have anemia. And you're making a list of the candidates for why women are having anemia. Okay, maybe they are having hookworm infestation, okay, multiple pregnancies, okay, or maybe they're having, some of them are having bleeding, okay, or they don't consume, or low socioeconomic status. So we are looking at biological causes. You can look at socioeconomic causes. Okay, maybe some of them have received iron supplementation and these are not receiving iron supplementation. They've been from remote areas, they've not had access to antenatal care. Okay, so there are so many things generation. So what we get is initial evidence that supports one or more of these candidates. Okay. So there are three main different types of descriptive studies: case reports or case series. You can have correlation studies, which are also known as, now let me take a break and ask you, the correlation study is also known as
ecological study.
Good. So you have three different types of descriptive studies: case reports or case series, correlational studies, and you have cross-sectional studies. So case reports and series, these types of studies in which, these are types of studies in which typically an astute clinician, astute is an alert, okay, an astute is a clinician who is aware, a clinician who reads. Okay, what happens is we finish our studies, we go and then you start practicing and you don't need, but you need to keep up with updates. You need to see what is happening. So an astute clinician will identify an unusual feature of a disease or a patient's history, which may lead to the formulation of a new hypothesis. This design has historical importance in epidemiology, as it was often used as an early means to identify the beginning or presence of an epidemic. Okay, so the whistleblower, the doctor in China who reported that there is some unusual type of pneumonia which is happening. Okay, he was an astute clinician. Okay, he recognized that this was not your typical, pneumonia that was occurring post-influenza, that this was a more severe type of influenza, which may be different. All right, so typically reported by saying new. Investigation of the activities of the affected individuals in the case series can then lead to formulation of a hypothesis. Okay, so and then these cases, okay, so the pneumonia, this severe pneumonia began occurring more common. Then they said, okay, this is something that's happening. So the minute you get a cluster of cases, you know that an epidemic is impending. Okay, so case report and case series. Okay, another example of an astute physician. So in late 1989, a physician, he saw 3 patients with unexplained eosinophilia and myalgia. Okay, myalgia is muscle pain. Okay, and normally, so these patients came with myalgia. When we looked at the blood report, he found that the eosinophil count was very high. Now that is unusual. Okay, normally when you have a high eosinophil count, like in tropical fever or hay fever, what you get is respiratory manifestations. Okay, you can get cough, you can get fever. Okay, that's usually associated with eosinophilia. But here it was more like myalgias, which look more like a viral thing. Okay, body aches. Okay, body aches, but there is eosinophilia. So he could not make a definitive diagnosis, but what he did was he said, I am seeing patients who are having eosinophilia as well as myalgia. Okay, so he notified the public health authorities. Within weeks, what happened was epidemiologists from the public health department, they had identified enough other cases to characterize the spectrum and course of the illness as a eosinophilia myalgia syndrome. So this was something new that happened, that you can get body aches with a high eosinophil count. And this has been documented as the eosinophilia myalgia syndrome. Okay, so again, role of an astute physician. You notice something unusual, you should alert, you should talk about it. Okay, I'm seeing something different. And especially when you see a cluster of cases of similar different, then you should be reporting it. Okay. Let's look at the timeline of HIV and AIDS. Okay. In 1981, in June, the US CDC, okay, they published a morbidity and mortality weekly report in which they described cases of a rare lung infection, Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, okay, PCP. And what was unusual is what? In 5 young, previously healthy gay men, okay? So men having sex with men, MSM, okay, they were called as gay men. Today, this term has been glowed, okay? So it was found that 5 healthy men reported with a rare infection, Pneumocystis carinii. Now, this does not occur. This usually occurs only in immunocompromised persons, okay? All the men had other unusual infections, indicating that their immune system was not working. And by the time this report was published, 2 of them had already died. Okay, so 2 people out of 5 people with an infection dying, that's a high mortality rate. Okay, so it was a severe infection. Okay, so this was reported. CDC also received reports of a cluster of cases of a rare and unusually aggressive cancer. Now again, another group of gay men, this was in New York and in California, they found cases of Kaposi sarcoma. So a rare lung infection, rare pneumonia, and a rare cancer, and occurring among a particular group of people. Okay. So what they did was they established a task force on Kaposi sarcoma and opportunistic infections to identify risk factors and to develop a case definition for national surveillance. By the year end, there was a total cumulative of 270 reported cases of severe immune deficiency among gay men. Can you see? Starting from something which was severe, looking at PCP and looking at Kaposi sarcoma, what they identified was severe immune deficiency among 270 men who were gay. Okay, and look at the mortality. 121 of them had already died because of the infection. So then they said there's something happening in this particular population. Okay, and it is causing death. Okay, and in 1982, CDC used the term acquired immune deficiency syndrome for the first time and released the first case definition of AIDS, a disease at least moderately predictive of a defect in cell-mediated immunity occurring in a person with no known case for diminished resistance to that disease. Okay, so this was the first case definition of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Okay, just to see how tracking a particular condition, identifying the people who are identified, what is the magnitude, it is causing death. Okay, and then they stumbled upon the identification of AIDS. So by 1984, they had identified all the major routes of transmission. They ruled out transmission by casual contact because this was causing panic now among the gay community. Okay, because reports were coming out that among gay people, there was this infection that was being spread. Now, many gay people also have other partners. Okay, so they have multiple partners. They also have partners. Sometimes they have partners even with heterosexual relationships. Okay, so this was causing panic among people. I mean, how can it be transmitted? And there were all kinds of theories going around at that point of time. Oh, it is because there's been transmission from monkeys. Okay, it was also reported that probably when somebody had traveled for Africa, there were enough of stories coming out in the 80s. Okay, in the mid 80s about postulated causes of AIDS and HIV infection. Okay, also if we touch them, if we shake hands, if we eat water, or if we eat their food, share food. Okay, there were so many questions coming out. So they were to disseminate the correct information, also to allay all the anxiety that came up with it, just like all the pandemic is causing so much of anxiety. Okay, so they ruled out transmission by casual contact. So if you touch, okay, hold hands, it's not going to spread HIV. If you share food, water, air, or environmental surfaces, it was not going to be transmitted. Okay, so they had identified major routes of transmission, and they were able to dispel doubts about what is the about the all the false rumors about HIV/AIDS. Okay, so that is just to give an example about how HIV/AIDS was tracked. Now let us look at ecological studies. So ecological studies, which are also known as correlational studies. In correlational studies, measures that represent characteristics of entire populations are used to describe disease in relation to some factors of interest such as age, calendar time, utilization of health services, or consumption of food, medication, or the other. Okay, so we are looking at population figures and looking at if there is exposure, what is the occurrence of a particular disease or health related condition. So why they are called as correlation is because between these two factors, we can draw a linear correlation. So if there is a real correlation, as you can see by the blue line here, okay, that indicates a positive correlation, okay, where your correlation coefficient is more than, okay, it lies between 0 and 1, okay, so it is more than 0. So if there is no correlation, then the correlation coefficient is 0. And the red line indicates a negative correlation. So a positive correlation says as exposure increases, the occurrence will also increase. In a negative correlation, as exposure increases, the occurrence will decrease. And if there is no correlation, you will not get any pattern and you will get a line and they will be all scattered across. Okay, so therefore, we can draw correlation between two variables, and that is why these are called as ecological studies or correlational studies. And it's because it's carried out at the level of the population, they're called as ecological studies. Okay, now for example, look at here. You're plotting time. This is an example of correlation, okay, at the level of, in San Francisco, in the city of San Francisco, these are the number of cases of Kaposi sarcoma. Okay, so as you can see, in the 70s, there were nothing. In 1980, a few cases. By the mid 80s, you had 140, okay, between more than 140 cases of Kaposi sarcoma, which was reported. Okay, so this is a type of ecological, okay, study. We are looking in at the level of the city, and we are looking at the number of cases and looking at over time, and look how it has increased. So there is something definitely occurring here. Okay. Then you can have cross-sectional descriptive studies. Okay, so you carry out a survey. A cross-sectional study is a survey of a population at a single point in time. This is usually done on a sample of the total population. It can be community-based or it can be hospital-based. Okay. Now, what we get information from here is the prevalence. So if you want to know what is the prevalence of a particular thing, you want to know what is the prevalence of diabetes, okay, you can carry out a cross-sectional study. If you want to know what is the prevalence of leprosy in the community, you can carry out a community-based study. If you want to know what is the prevalence of nosocomial pseudomonas infection in the renal units, okay, because in the renal patients, because they are on dialysis, okay, and they come frequently, they are admitted, okay, they stay for a long period of time, okay. So what is the prevalence of nosocomial infection? If you want to find out how, that's a hospital-based study. So you can get prevalence, you can identify prevalence of conditions. Then because you're carrying out the study, if you're doing a quantitative, for example, if you look at hemoglobin of pregnant women, okay, so you will know what you want to know, what is the mean hemoglobin level, what is the average hemoglobin level, you will be able to get when you do a cross-sectional study. Okay, you can look at the hemoglobin level in pregnant women, you can look at what is the protein among patients, okay, persons with tuberculosis, okay, immune function may be suppressed, protein very important for the immunity. you want to know if they're more severe or admitted, want to know what are their albumin levels, you can find out. Okay, so that is another research question. You want to do what is the relationship of serum protein levels with recovery rate among persons with tuberculosis. Okay, so depending on what type of study, what you want to find out, you want to find out prevalence, you want to find out mean levels, average levels, you do a cross-sectional study. So we can describe a pattern. Okay, that's why they're called as descriptive studies. What is the pattern of antibiotic prescription in an acute medical ward? Okay, what is the knowledge, attitude, and practices regarding contraceptives in a community? This is a pattern. Okay, so you can describe the pattern. Cross-sectional studies in which outcome and exposure are determined simultaneously. Okay, because it is at one point of time, you go into the community or you go to the hospital and you ask them, okay, at one point of time, you're looking at both exposure as well as at outcome. Okay, so therefore we call them as prevalence studies. The observed outcomes are prevalent. I hope you remember what is incidence and prevalence, which has already been taken for you. Incidence is number of new cases, its prevalence is both old as well as new cases. So when you do a cross-sectional study or a survey, you will get for chronic disease both old cases as well as new cases. Those who have been recently diagnosed and those who had the disease for a long period of time. So that is called as, that is why we report prevalence and not incidence. You will also get data on risk factor associations, will accordingly represent both survival as well as etiology. Now, it cannot be ruled out that the exposure under observation has changed after and maybe because of the outcome. It cannot always be determined which came first, the exposure or the outcome. For example, we may say that sedentary lifestyle is causing obesity. Okay, so people are sitting and watching TV for a long period of time and we are saying it may be causing obesity. But when you do a survey and you find that obese people are watching more TV, okay, you cannot say it's whether the obesity is causing them to watch TV or whether the watching TV has made them obese. Okay, we cannot determine whether exposure came first or the outcome. It may be that they became fat and they can't do any other thing and therefore they're sitting in front of the TV. Okay, so when we draw conclusions from cross-sectional studies, there are limitations to our conclusions. Okay. So types of descriptive studies are longitudinal descriptive studies in contrast to the cross-sectional descriptive study. A longitudinal descriptive study will follow up a single group of subjects over a defined period of time. Okay, so one group, long period of time, it is more scientific, but it is also more costly and it is also time consuming. Okay. Now the steps in conducting a descriptive study, you define a population which has to be studied, you define the disease to be studied, you describe the disease in terms of time, place and person. So it's very important. First you want to identify whom you want to study. You want to take group of pregnant women, you want to take under 5 children, you want to take geriatric, you want to take adults, you want to take all people. Okay, so you have to define your population. Then you have to define what you want to study. Okay, you have to define what is your outcome that you're looking for. And then you have to describe. Okay, so what is happening in terms of what is the difference? Okay, time, place and person, you describe it. So when we talk about time trends of disease, we can define it according to calendar, or it can be defined as seasonal fluctuations or cyclical fluctuations. Short-term fluctuations are called as epidemics. Long-term fluctuations are called as secular trends. Short-term epidemic fluctuations, they are usually because of infectious agents or because of chemical toxins. They can be either because of common vehicle, either eating common, okay, you're using food, water, contaminated well, or they are propagated. Propagated is person-to-person transmission. Now, tell me, in the current pandemic, what type of transmission is occurring? How is COVID being transmitted? What type of a pandemic is this? Is this a common source or is it a propagated? Okay, let me see. How many of you are keeping up? Tell me, pandemic, COVID-19, how is it propagated? It's an epidemic, right? It was an epidemic. What type of epidemic is it? Is it a common source or is it a propagated? How many are listening? I need to hear some answer. I need to know you're there.
But it transmits person to person. If first one person infected, then other person is infected, then it infects another third person.
How is it infecting? Because how is getting it is multiplying within the host. Okay, so it uses an infected patient. Very good, Roshan, right? So it is multiplying within the host, right? Because your COVID-19 goes, the virus goes in, it propagates, it multiplies within the host. So it infects one person. Then from one person, how many? Why is it calling propagated? It will infect another 3. What is the RO here? It is between 2 to 3. Okay, so a minimum of 2 to 3 persons get infected by one affected person. Then that further 3 people who are infected will further infect another 2-3 persons. So can you see how it is getting propagated from one person? It is now gone to 3 people. From 3 people it goes to 9. From 9 it will go to, okay, 9 3s are 24 at least, 24. From 24 people it will go further, and so the reproduction is occurring and propagation is occurring. Okay, so that is why COVID-19 is known as a propagated. Okay, you can have propagated, can be person to person, it can also be because of vectors. Okay, vectors can transmit. Okay, vector will bite infected person and then bite one person who is infected with malaria. Okay, so mosquito bites, it picks up the gametocyte. Then what will it do? It will go and it will bite many more people. Okay, and so from one person many more people will get affected, and so it is known as propagated. Okay, long-term secular trends are changes in disease which occur over a period of decades. Okay, it takes a long time. For example, with cancer, you don't get it does not come like how this happened, right? It may indicate changes in distribution of risk factors or the effects of improved diagnosis and or treatment. So we have right now from the 1915 onwards, we've had a rise in the number of chronic diseases. Okay, so coronary heart disease, lung cancer, they're all been increasing over a long period. But this lung cancer trends, you have to look over the last 50 years, 100 years. Okay, not over the last 1 year and 2 years. You can look over 1 or 2, but it shows the secular trend, the rise in pattern will show over many years. Okay. Seasonal fluctuations, usually activities related to vectors. If you look at malaria, JE and all of that, when you look at seasonal fluctuations, okay, whenever there's rain, these are all water associated, vector borne, where they breed in water. So whenever there's a little rain, moisture increases, a little while they'll increase and you will get rise in the number of cases of malaria, you will get rise in the increases of, so you get seasonal fluctuations. Cyclical fluctuations are periodic changes which occur over a few years, like 2 to 5 years. Okay, so we know cyclic fluctuations occur. Okay, epidemics, measles every 3 years. Okay, you get influenza, seasonal influenza, you get, okay, you will get a new strain occurring every 7 years. All right, and you will get a pandemic occurring every 50 years because it takes time for your antigenic shift and the drift to occur. Okay, so when we talk about time trends, especially infectious disease, you can talk about epidemics, seasonal fluctuations, cyclical fluctuations. When you look at non-communicable disease, you're looking at secular trends. Okay, this is to remind you, epidemic curve, very important. You're in the season of a pandemic, so you should know what this curve means. Okay, so we have plotted. Okay, so you have time on the x-axis. And then you have the number of cases which are occurring, incidence, number of new cases which are occurring on the y-axis. Okay, when you plot the number of new cases against the time, this time can be in terms of days, weeks, it can be in terms of months. Okay, and this is an epidemic curve. Okay, can you see a rise, a sharp rise and a fall? So what is this typically is, this epidemic curve shows that most of your cases are occurring within one incubation period. Okay, and the peak of the curve from the time you get the first case, okay, and the suspected case till the peak is your median incubation period. Okay, your maximum incubation period is when the epidemic falls. Okay, so up to that time also That is your maximum incubation period. Now it's important for you to know incubation is important because especially when it comes to isolation and quarantine, for how long do you quarantine people who have been exposed, or do you isolate persons who have been infected? Depends on the incubation period. So incubation period is very important for the quarantine. Okay, so now people are saying first initially it was 2 weeks, then they said okay 10 days, now they said okay 1 week, then they say okay 5 days now. Okay, but still people are developing even after 5 days of quarantining. When they have gone out, after 10 days they have developed the disease. Okay, so if you want to pick up those cases, therefore it's important that we have contact tracing. Then we can pick up those cases. Okay, incubation period is important because especially health related restrictions, travels, especially a place which does not have the disease, they will not want you to bring the infection into the country, right? So incubation period is important for us to remember. And so what this tells you is that when you plot a simple thing like plotting the cases against time, will tell you what type of epidemic we are looking at. Okay, so you can have a common source, single exposure. This is what I showed you. Okay, we plot the time, all cases occurring within one incubation period. Epidemic curve has a sharp onset, equally abrupt decline. The peak of the epidemic is sharp. It coincides with the median incubation period. So when you see this kind of a graph, you know that you're looking at something that is occurring within one incubation period. And so it could be, you can also identify what could be the cause of the source. When you look at something like this is a common source continuous epidemic. Can you see how it goes? So there's a rise, then there's a plateauing, then there's a rise and a plateauing, and then it goes, okay, over a period. This is a common source continuous curve. And this is a propagated curve, and this is what we are seeing in the COVID. Okay, so looking when you plot, so a simple thing like plotting cases against the time can give you a clue into what is happening. Okay, so if you don't know, we can say, okay, we're looking at propagates. Can you see multiple? So what happens is you get multiple waves. You don't get one single wave. Okay, so you're getting multiple waves. As more exposure occurs, there's more waves, multiple waves. And because it's being propagated, it will also go down in waves. And this is for the place distribution. International variations, national, rural, urban differences. Again, all very much highlighted during the COVID pandemic. We've seen how urban areas are more affected as compared to rural areas. We've seen some nations being more affected as compared to other nations. So there have been international variations within the nations. Also, we have had variation. Okay, so place distribution also, just to show you the importance. So tell you how when we talk about person distribution, we're talking about the age. Okay, we're talking about age, sex, ethnicity, marital status. Again, all of these also have been highlighted. In Nepal, if you look at the COVID persons who have been affected with COVID, males outnumber women 2:1. Okay, almost 66, almost 2/3 of the cases, reported cases, are male and 1/3 are female. So is it because there are more males, there are more, is a biological reason, or is it because of behavioral reason? Or is it because we have had most migrants who are young males who are coming back and they carried? So this is what is being looked at. Okay, if you look at COVID infections, more among males, lesser among females, but females have been impacted in other men because of the pandemic, because of the lockdown, okay, because of the work burden. So age, ethnicity, they found difference in antibody responses among ethnicities, especially in countries where you have multiple ethnicities. Okay, of course, we know that the lower socioeconomic strata have borne the brunt as compared to higher socioeconomic strata. Okay, housing density, especially in this pandemic, we have realized social status and housing condition has played a lot of because airborne. So wherever you had overcrowding, they've had more transmission. So even within Kathmandu, our pockets are where we've had crowded areas, we've had higher transmission as compared to less population dense areas, and housing where you had lesser. So wherever density is lesser, it's played a role. Okay, so these are all the host factors. So today we will stop with this much. We have done an extensive review and I hope you will remember, and I cannot emphasize enough the importance of epidemiology and for you to understand it and read it thoroughly. This is a must know subject in community medicine. Okay, so thank you all for your patient listening, and I will stop the class here now. Stay safe, and I hope to see you all soon for practicals. we are hoping to open up. Have you all been informed? Have the students been informed about coming back to college?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so we hope to open up and we hope to see you from the 1st of Jan. So I think 3rd of Jan onwards. I hope to see all of you in person during the practicals. Okay, so stay safe. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.